Today's daf is daf Samach Vav, and we were learning from different psukim, analyzing biblical exegesis in one way or another to prove that Mimachras HaShabbos is the day after the first day of Pesach, not the day after Shabbos. And here on the top of daf Samach Vav, the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Each one has his own proof. In fact, Rabbi Yossi apparently is not happy with his first proof, and therefore he offers an alternative proof. And basically, what we saw yesterday on the bottom of Samachei Amid Beis was a proof from Rabbi Yossi, from Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, to the effect that it says Loch, Tispar Loch, and Loch is a pasuk that addresses Bezdin, which means that Bezdin is in charge of Kiddush HaChodesh, and therefore we know exactly when the Omer should be brought, because it's going to be already determined once Bezdin establishes Rosh Chodesh. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, emphasizes the fact that if the phrase Mimachras HaShabbos would refer to Shabbos Breishis, as the Baitusim insisted, then it would come out that when it says Mimachras HaShabbos, if, let's say, Shabbos would fall in the middle of Pesach, and in the language of Rabbi Yossi, V'chi nemar Mimachras HaShabbos shebetocha Pesach, Halolo nemar el Mimachras HaShabbos, D'chol hashana kula malei Shabbosos, Tzeu b'dok Eis Shabbos. In other words, if the Torah is being deliberately vague and it means the day after Shabbos, then which Shabbos did the Torah intend it to be? It cannot be the day after Shabbos, because that would change, or that would offer so many, different possibilities. We'll see later on that the Gemara is going to analyze Rabbi Yossi's proof, but Rabbi Yossi now brings another proof, the Ode, Nemar Shabbos Lamata, Nemar Shabbos Lamata, Lamala, because twice the Torah mentions Shabbos, once in reference to the Shtei Alechem of Shavuos, and once in reference to the Korban Omer, and we should equate the two by analogy, Malahalan Regel Utchilas Regel, Afkan Regel Utchilas Regel. Right? So in other words, when the Torah used the word Shabbos in the context of Shtei Alechem, then clearly it's referring to Shavuos, because that's the only day that you bring the Shtei Alechem, and therefore by analogy we should just apply the same principle to the word Shabbos in the Omer, and it's referring not to Shabbos Breishis, but rather to the Tchilas HaRegel. And then we get to Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Kosev Echad Omer Sheishes Yomim Tochal Matzos, Kosev Echad Omer Shivas Yom Tochal Matzos. HaKetzad, there's a stereo. Do you eat matzah for 6 days or 7 days? And now, according to the Prushim, we have a very fine resolution of this contradiction. Matzah shiyata yochel yochla shiva min achodosh. Right before you bring the Omer on the first, right? So as far as the status of the matzah the first day, it's chodosh, and you can't eat it. So therefore, you'll only end up with 6 days of eating matzah. You can only eat 6 days of Chodesh. Okay, now the Gemara goes on with the continuation of this brisa, and the question is, when do you do the Ktsiras HaOmer? When do you do the Sfiras HaOmer? The pasuk says, Miyom Haviachem Tisperu. So Yochel Yiktzar V'yovi. Maybe the pasuk is telling you that on the very same day that you do the Ktsiras HaOmer, you also bring the Korban HaOmer. the Amosai Sheyirtze Yispar. And then we shift the emphasis off the Sphira, and basically, whenever you get a chance, you'll count the Omer. Talmud Lomer, therefore the Pasuk adds, Mehechel Chermesh Bakama Tachel Lispar, right? Which means on the very day that the barley is cut down, that's the day in which you start counting. And why is that? Because that's the day after you count it that you bring the Omer. So at this point in the presentation of the Brisa, it would seem that the Ktsiras HaOmer, the Havas HaOmer, and the Sfiras HaOmer all take place on the same day. So the Gemara now explains, but wait a minute. If you only had the first pasuk, then you would assume that on the Ktsira, you go ahead after the Ktsira and you count the Omer. And when are you going to count the Omer? Yochel Yiktzar. Once you do the Ktsira of the Omer, then Yispar, so then you'll bring the Omer whenever you want, because as long as you did the Ktsira and the Sphira together, you don't need to actually bring the Omer on the same day. Talmud Lomer Miyom Haviachem. Okay, fine. Miyom Haviachem is going to teach me that you count from the day that you bring the Omer. So you can't count until the day of the Omer that is brought. So the Gemara asks, well, wait a minute, Yom Haviachem is then Yochel Yiktzar v'Yispar v'Yovi b'Yom. Like I said before, maybe all three, the Ktsira, the Sphira, and the Havas HaOmer should all take place on the same day, meaning during the day. You have to count 7 full weeks. Now the halachic day begins at night. Amosai Tamotze, how could you achieve Sheva Shabbos Tmimos? Only if you count at night. It means that the whole day is counted. And therefore it's Tmimos. So the counting and the Ktsira will be at night. And Avos HaOmer will be by day, because all Karbanos are brought by day. Yachol, I might think that Yiktzar v'Yovi v'Yispar b'Layla, maybe we should shift everything to the night. Talmud Lomer Yom Haviachem. So now we see that at least Avos HaOmer is during the day. And if that be the case, maybe we should assume that the Ktsira and the Sfiras HaOmer is also by day. So how do we reconcile this? Ketzad, Ktsiro Sfir Balayla, Ve'Hava Bayom. Since Hava is part of the Avod of Karbanos, and Avod of Karbanos is always during the day, so we know therefore that Yom Haviachem is referring to the Avos HaKarban by day. On the other hand, the Ktsir and the Sfir could be by night. And the Sfir has to be by night, as we said before, because you need Shevas Avosos Tmimos, and the day begins at night. The Ktsira also, like the Sphira, has to be at night, because the Torah indicates in the Pasuk Me'achel Charmesh Tachel Lispar, right, that you're going to begin your counting with the Ktsira. We said in order to get Shavas Abasos Tmimos, your counting has to be by night, and since the reaping of the Saora will now coincide with the Sphira, then the Ktsira, the reaping of the Omer, will be at night. Omar Rav. Kulu Islay Pircha, all the different presentations that we had to prove the Shita of the Prushim, namely that Menachos Shabbos referring to the first day of Pesach, each one of them can be refuted. It has a Pircha. Bar, with the exception of Mitarte Tanoi Basroi, with the exception of the last two Tanoim on the list, Bein B'Masnisa, Kamaisa Bein Masnisa Basraisa, even both in the first price and the second price, let's say pircha, they don't have pircha. So now the Gemara goes through all the different yalfusas that we had and demonstrates why each one has a refutation. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had a stira, excuse me, between one pasuk that says he count the weeks and the other pasuk that says he count the days. So the Gemara says that's not a problem. We can reconcile that question because they look at Abaye. mitzvah lemimni yomer, mitzvah lemishvui, that the mitzvah of counting the Omer comprises two parts. You have to count both the days and the nights. So when it says in one pasuk, it says that you count 50 days, which means that you can count any day of the week. And the other pasuk says we should count weeks. Is you count days, and then when you reach the seventh day, you count it as a week, and you do this every 7 days, and you count 7 weeks. The Gemara now says, Imid Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, who both came up with the same argument that the Omer has to be brought on a fixed day of the month. The might to be Yom Tov Rishon Koi. Okay, fine. It has to be on a specific day of the month. But how do you know it has to be at the beginning of Yom Tov, meaning right after the 15th of Nisan, Yom Tov Achron Koi? Maybe it's referring to the seventh day of Pesach, which also has a status of Yom Tov. So basically, what the Gemara is saying now is that although the Baitusim have a problem with this, but we too have a problem because we don't know whether to start counting the Omer after the first day of the holiday, meaning on the 16th of Nisan, or after the seventh day of the holiday. To Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Leslu Pirch. However, says Rava, there is a combination of these two Tanoim, meaning Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yehuda, they came up with an argument, a proof, a biblical exegesis, as we called it, that has no refutation, has no pirch. Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira proved that the Omer must be brought at the beginning of Pesach, which is going to undermine the position of the Baitusim, who say it's off that they bring the Omer on the Sunday, which could fall either at the end or even after the whole Yontif is over. And their proofs specify the beginning of the Yontif. So it has to be a reference to the first day of Yontif. And therefore, the seventh day of Yontif is not the first day, but rather the last day. So that works out very well. The Gemara says the following. In the second brisa, it says, I mid Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Right, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda had a proof from the fact that the Torah says you have to count 50 days every year. And that's against the Baitusim because they maintain that in a year when Pesach starts on Shabbos, the count will last for 50 days from the second day of the festival, which would also be true according to the Prushim. But in other years, the count could end up more than 50 days after the second day. For example, let's say Pesach begins not on Saturday, but on Sunday, and then the counting of the Omer is delayed 6 days because we have to make sure that it's Mimochras HaShabbos, so we have to wait till the next Sunday. So then you could add an extra 6 days, counting from Sunday till the next Sunday, and you end up with 56 days. So the Gemara says no. That proof is not convincing because Hava Mina, the Baitusim could counter argue, Dilma Chamshin Lebar Mehani Shisa. Maybe when the Torah says 50 days, it means cut out the last 6 days. So again, the proof of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda in the second brisa was based on the fact that you count 50 days, and it's got to be 50 days from the day that you actually begin counting. So therefore, in some years, when the count begins on the second day of the holiday, then it doesn't matter that in other years it begins 6 days later, since in each case the count only lasts for 50 days. So again, depending on which day of the week Pesach falls, the count could last anywhere from 1 to 6 extra days. Then we had a proof made Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, right? His proof was basically the same proof as Rabbi Eliezer, is Dil Miyontav Achron Koi. As we said before, that doesn't prove that you start counting in the beginning of Pesach. Maybe you start counting the Omer at the end of Pesach. And Rabbi Yossi Nami Chazile Pircha. Rabbi Yossi himself, actually, when he presented this logic, which we saw also from Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseir. He also obviously shied away from it because Hainu Tekom V'Yod. That's why he offered a second proof, and he wasn't sufficient for him the first proof. Gufa, Omer, Abaye, Mitzvah, Lemimne, Yomi, Mitzvah, Lemimne, we have to count both days and weeks. Rabbana Deve Ravashi, in fact, did that. Manu Yomi, Umanu Shvui. However, Memar Mani Yomi, he only counted days. Velo Mani Shvui, he never counted the weeks. And he declared, Omer, he explained, because Zeichel Amigdashu, because we don't have the Omer today. The entire entity of Sfiras Omer, counting the Omer when we don't have the Omer, is all Zeichel Amigdash. So Zeichel Amigdash, we don't have to go all out and count both days and weeks. It's enough that we count days. And all the Mefarshim are bothered by this because we should do a Zeichel Mikdash that's a replica of what they did at the time of the Mikdash. And if at the time of the Mikdash they counted not only days but also weeks, as we saw by to reconcile the two psukim, then when we do a Zeichel Mikdash in the absence of the Mikdash, we should do identically what we did before. So that remains a difficult question. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Samach Vav. Kitzaru v'nasnu v'kupos. Okay, now we go through the entire process of Ktsiras HaOmer and what happens afterwards. Because from the Ktsiras HaOmer, we have to take the barley, crush it, and make it into a flour. So first of all, Nasnua Lakupos, after they cut down the barley, they put it into baskets, and then if the Ula Azara, then it had to go into the Azara. Hoymahavin Oso Ba'ar. According to Rabbi Meir, Kedei l'kayim mitzvahs koli, the Torah says about the mitzvah of the Omer, it's got to be koli, and Rabbi Meir understands that the word koli means it's got to be toasted on the fire, and that's exactly what you do. Chachamim, on the other hand, disagree with Rabbi Meir, and they say bekanim ubeklachos chovted also. Wait a minute, we're not going to toast the barley immediately after we cut it down. That's not a good idea, but rather we should beat it with soft reeds and stems, remove the kernels from the stalks, kedesh lo yismaich, so that we use soft reeds and stems, not hard implements, so that it shouldn't be crushed. And then nasnuhu li abuv. They didn't immediately put it over the fire, but first they put it in the threshed kernels into a copper pipe, and there it will be toasted while it's in the copper pipe. The abuv menukov, the pipe was perforated, kadeshia ha'ar sholet bekulo, so that the fire could enter throughout and penetrate through all the perforations. And then shtachu Bazar. Then the barley was threshed, toasted, spread out in the azara. V'ruach menashevesbo, and the wind would blow on it, and that's very significant because when the wind would blow on it, then it would dry up any moisture in the kernels, because the Torah says that it's got to be koli, which means totally dry. And it could be that there was moisture that came out through the pipe, so therefore we have to dry it. And not only that, but Nesnu Rechaim Shel Grossos, they would have to put it into a mill that's used to mill beans. Hotziu Mimenu Isaron, until they finally crushed it and they got a full Isaron's worth of soles, of fine flour. And in order to achieve that, they had to sift it 13 times. Bashar nifta. Now, if there's remainder, in other words, you don't need all that much for the Karv Mincha of the Omer, then the remainder is nifta. It's only got Kedushas Domim, which means it's subject to Piron. To Pijon, and you can redeem it and transfer the Kedusha from whatever remains of the flour onto mos, onto kesef. And then nechal cholodim, anybody could eat it. But there's going to be a big, gigantic issue here about maser. Why? Because the Mishnah says nechal chol adam, it could be eaten by anyone, but only after you are mafresh chala, chayav b'chala. You have to give something to the Kohen. But potem in a masa, you don't have to give 10% to the Levi. And Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says, no, you're chayiv not only in challah, but also in masa. So that's going to be the last sugya that we do on Amud Beis. I don't know if we're going to be able to really go through that today. Maybe we'll cover it on a very superficial level, and then we'll pick it up tomorrow. But anyway, Torah Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa. The Torah teaches us, with regard to the Omer, that it's got to be Aviv. And the word Aviv does not indicate a time of the year, which we fit in very nicely with the Baitusim in any event, but rather this Aviv means something totally different. Let's first read the pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'im." Again, this is in Vayikra, the second parak. V'im takriv minchas bikurim. That's a reference to the Karban Omer, and it's bikurim lashem aviv kolui ba'esh geresh Carmel. So we already discussed Carmel. Now, and also we discussed Kalui. Now we're mentioning Aviv. And Aviv means the spring in the sense that's the first. The spring is called the spring the first. That's Aviv. So then when you cut down the barley, the first that you cut is going to be designated for the Omer. Then it says Kalui B'Eish, as we said before, with all the different nuances of the Machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chacham. Let's read it again. Rabbi Meir holds Malami Chol Yisro Mahavavin Oso B'Eish. Right? They would take this barley, and it was an ear of barley, and they would take the ear and toast it over the fire. Why? Because the Torah says it's got to be koli. Koli means toasted. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Chacham Omrim. Okay, here we're going to turn to Talmud Beis.